Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to the very last talk of this conference. Thank you all very much for having been here and participated, and thank you for your questions, and thanks everyone who's speaking for their talks. So I'm delighted to announce Wolfgang Schwarz with the title Lewis's Empiricism.
Yes, thanks, Frederick. I think it's been a great pleasure for me to be here, and I'm sure for many of you as well. We've learned a lot, and people have thanked you before, but I think we should have a round of applause for Helen and Frederick and everybody. Okay, so I want to talk about something that's long puzzled me about Lewis's philosophy, and I don't really have an answer, so I'll just present basically this puzzle to you. And in a nutshell, the puzzle is that Lewis's epistemology, along with his philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, seems to leave little room for substantive inquiry into non-contingent matters. Like all knowledge, all real knowledge is knowledge of contingent things. But then, for most of his career, he seemed to be in the pursuit of non-contingent knowledge, like knowledge of non-contingent matters, like are there other worlds, and what are they, and how many are there? Lots of questions like this, which seem to be non-contingent. And the question is, how does that fit together? What was he thinking he's doing, given that his official epistemology doesn't really leave room for this kind of enterprise? So the plan is, I'll first remind you of relevant bits of Lewis's epistemology, and I'll highlight the way in which they don't seem to leave room for the kind of inquiry Lewis then seemed to be engaged in. And then I'll spell out the problem, but it's kind of obvious to see, and make some attempts at possible answers, like how could we combine these two tenets. Okay, so I'll begin by reminding you of bits of Lewis's epistemology. So Lewis's preferred epistemology was Bayesian, right? So in the Bayesian model, in Lewis's model at least, the belief states are represented by a probability measure over the possible worlds, like the worlds, the Lewisian worlds. And these beliefs change by conditionalization. So when new evidence comes in from our senses, you become certain, probability 1, of some evidence proposition, and the other probabilities are renormalized. Details will be completely irrelevant. There's also a sketch of a non-Bayesian epistemology, characteristic for Lewis. He didn't really think we have to do it only one way. So there's an all or nothing epistemology of, I guess in a sense of the word, knowledge and analysis of knowledge in elusive knowledge, where he suggests that the content of our knowledge is given by the set of worlds where we have the same evidence that we actually have, minus worlds that are properly ignored, right, if you know the paper. Otherwise, this is going to be slightly mysterious. So the idea is, I know that I have hands because if you look at the set of worlds where I have the same evidence that I have, the same perceptions, the same memories, in almost all of those worlds, I do have hands, except in some skeptical scenarios where it seems like I have hands, but I have none. But these worlds can be ignored. That's why I know I have hands. That's the story in elusive knowledge. So details, both stories come with lots of details, which won't be relevant. One thing they both have in common is what Richard Jeffrey called hardcore empiricism. It's this idea that our senses provide us with an infallible certain basis on which other knowledge is built. And that's obvious in the Bayesian story. The evidence proposition has probability 1. You become absolutely certain of it, and probability never goes down. In elusive knowledge, it's also quite plain that whatever our evidence is, everyone knows what the evidence is in a very strong sense, so that even under intense skeptical pressure, you'll never lose that knowledge, right? It comes out trivial, because you know something if it's the case throughout all the worlds where you have that evidence, minus maybe some things that are ignored. But so you'll always know what evidence you have. There's a little problem, as an aside. I'm sure this has been discussed somewhere, that if you take the letter of what Lewis says in elusive knowledge, he seems to suggest that we should all know, even under intense skeptical pressure, what brain states we're in, because with the worlds compatible with our evidence are the worlds where we have the same perceptions and memory. And what are perceptions and memories? Well, they're physical states for Lewis. So we should all know what brain states we're in, which we patently don't. So this is a little, I think this can be solved, this problem. It's not a serious problem, but just something that I'm also a bit curious about what Lewis thought about this. In general, what did he think were these evidence propositions of which we can be certain? It's really not entirely clear. And it's not too important. I think there are ways of spelling out both pictures, and it's clear how it goes in the Bayesian picture, where we would replace the hardcore empiricism that Lewis kind of likes by something else he says that's okay as well, which is Jeffrey's own model, where we don't conditionalize in the standard way where you become certain of something, but you just become somewhat certain of it, and that's okay as well. So that would be softcore empiricism, as Jeffrey calls it. Anyway, so this just as a reminder, why is any of this called empiricism? Well, one way to see it is that all real epistemic progress comes from our senses, right? So new evidence, then beliefs change. New evidence, then you know more. By thinking, you don't acquire any knowledge, right? So it's the senses that make us have some epistemic progress and not anything else. There are other aspects in which this kind of epistemology isn't empiricist in some like family resemblance sense. So many empiricists are skeptical about inference to the best explanation and positing hidden things we could never observe. Lewis is not skeptical about these things, right? He's happy to trust science, for example. So scientists take some evidence and they postulate various hidden things. And Lewis is happy with that. He trusts that that's going to work. I mean, there are worlds where it doesn't work, but they can be ignored. So he's happy to allow for inductive inference and for abductive inference. That's all okay by Lewis's lights. And that's not like when I speak of Lewis as empiricism, I mean an empiricism that isn't the strong kind of empiricism where you want everything we know or can rationally believe to be definable in terms of experience or to be logically entailed by experience or anything like this, right? There are softer inferences that are okay for this kind of empiricism. And this gives us some kind of a priori knowledge, right? So maybe it's a priori in some sense that the unobserved resembles the observed, because that's something we can assume rationally even without having relevant experience. It's part of the prior with which a rational Bayesian agent starts. It's the inductive method, as Lewis calls it in radical interpretation. So maybe that's kind of a priori, because it's not something you can rationally believe and know. The other worlds are excluded, not on the basis of some evidence. It's the kind of knowledge, though, that goes away when you look at it, right? So it's not conclusive a priority, and it doesn't have probability 1. There is also conclusive a priori knowledge in this picture, but there's only one example. Well, there are other examples for technical reasons, but only one sort of interesting example, and it's the set of all worlds, right? That's the one proposition which everyone always knows, independent of what evidence they have, and that has probability 1. It never has any other probability. So that's some kind of a priori knowledge, but it's not something that you can acquire, right? It's not something you can learn. It's not like we first are unsure about the set of all worlds, and then we do some thinking, and then we become sure. Like you start being certain of it. It doesn't even make sense in these models that some agent does not assign probability 1 to the set of all worlds. So these are the models, and the fact that, so in some sense, all necessary truths are always known and always have probability 1 in these models, which Lewis didn't invent, but Lewis liked these models and he drew on them. And this fact is called the problem of logical omniscience in informal epistemology, and it's widely regarded to be a serious flaw. And I quite like this fact. I think it gets something deeply right, because I'm an empiricist, well, in some sense. And at least I like empiricism. And I like this idea that if you're ignorant of something, then you're lacking information. And if you're lacking information, then you lack information about this contingent world around us. What else could you lack information about, right? How could there be some non-contingent aspect of reality to which you gain access by thinking? That just seems mysterious and unnecessary to me. So I'd like to endorse this surprising conclusion that really there is no such thing as interesting substantive inquiry into non-contingent subject matters that goes by reasoning. I think there's something deeply right about denying that phenomenon. So I should also mention it's not easy to get rid of logical omniscience. So you might think this is sort of a technical thing. It's just the models go a little simpler. If we ignore sort of hyperintentional knowledge, we could just add it back in, like we could add back air resistance and friction in some model of mechanics, and it would make the equations a bit more complicated, but it wouldn't really change much. But I think it really, if you try to add back into these nice models that Lewis likes, something that gives you non-trivial knowledge and ignorance of necessary truths, everything becomes murky and difficult. It's entirely unclear how to do it. The models completely change their character. I don't have time to go through this, but you could kind of see it in Frank's talk today, which is more on the language side. But as I said, the epistemology here includes the mind and language part. And Frank's entire story was about contingent matters, right? Here's the world. It could be this way, that way. You have a partition. And then Al asked, but what about maths? And there isn't really a natural way of then saying, and what do we do when we communicate about maths that doesn't really give up lots of the nice things Frank said. And I like these nice things as well. So I want to say, in some sense, maths is strange. And the fact that it doesn't really fit is not something you can easily fix, and it's basically still the same story. Oh, and I should say one thing for clarification, because it's often misunderstood. So I don't know if there are infinitely many twin primes, nor do you, nor does anybody else, because it's an open question. Okay, non-contingent, I don't know it. Have we refuted these models that assume that all necessary truths are known? The answer is no, because of something Lewis rightly emphasizes, which is that there's a very indirect connection between the truth of an attitude report and the relevant attitude that makes that true. As Lewis says on the plurality of worlds, this connection is complicated and multifarious. And I could talk about this for a long time. So one of the examples I find convincing, Lewis likes to give of this are quotational effects. So I think this example is due to Bob Stolnecker. There are lots of examples like this. So suppose I wonder whether ophthalmologists are eye doctors, right? Maybe I see a shop ophthalmologist. I wonder, is an ophthalmologist an eye doctor? And so the proposition ophthalmologists are eye doctors is the necessary truth, plausibly, right? So like the set of worlds where that's true is the set of all worlds, because ophthalmologist means eye doctor. So do I wonder whether this necessary truth obtains? And intuitively, I think it's quite plausible. No, that's not what I really wonder about. What I really wonder about is whether the word ophthalmologists, as it's used in English, or maybe as it's used on that shop, maybe that's all I wonder about, means eye doctor. So I wonder about something that's contingent, because that word could be used for all kinds of things, right? It could mean banana. So what I wonder about, really, the underlying attitude that's reported by I wonder whether ophthalmologists are eye doctors is one whose content isn't the content expressed by the complement sentence. Right? It's not the necessary truth, but a contingent truth. So the point is, just because there's some interesting attitude reports that seem to imply that we are not logically omniscient and mathematically omniscient, you can't immediately say, oh, therefore, this whole theory is wrong. We need a story of how these attitude reports connect to the theory, which doesn't really leave room, or seem to leave room, for knowledge of necessary truths. But it's not obvious what that story is. Until we've told the story, there's no easy refutation. Anyway, this is just for clarification. So now, as I said, I like this kind of model that doesn't really leave much room for knowledge and inquiry into non-contingent things. And I suspect I like it more than Lewis. So Lewis, when he mentions these models, he says, oh yeah, there's an idealization. But he never sort of explains how that can be idealized away. And when he does point at something, he points at Stolnecker, who likes the model also as much as I do, so more than I suspect Lewis did. And Stolnecker tries to explain how it seems like we have knowledge of non-contingent matters by doing the kind of trick I just did with ophthalmologists. He said maybe all of maths is somehow knowledge of contingent facts about words and structures and somewhat. It's not spelled out in any details, but so I don't really know. Maybe Lewis liked it as much as I do. Maybe he didn't. So maybe Lewis just thought these are nice models, and really we need to add a rationalist element, and there's some non-contingent facts we can find out about by thinking. I really don't know. But I like the empiricist epistemology, and so I just want to see, can I make sense of all the rest Lewis did, especially in his metaphysics, if I hold on to this epistemology that I like? Okay, so I hope you're with me. All you need to remember from, sorry, I have no hand on nothing to guide you. So all you need to remember from what I've said so far is Lewis's epistemology, the official epistemology, both the Bayesian and the non-Bayesian one, leaves no room for progress on non-contingent matters, right? You can't find out about something that's non-contingent. And let's just go with this, right? For whatever reasons, he believed this. Or maybe didn't even believe, but let's just assume that is so. Now, the tension is lots of what he did in metaphysics in particular seemed like, let's try to make progress on this question which is non-contingent. Right? So, obvious example, modal realism. If modal realism is true, it's not a contingent truth. It's not supposed to be one. Like, maybe you disagree, but Lewis thought clearly it's not a contingent truth. It's not just true in this world. Modal realism is, if true, is a necessary truth. So, if you think of modal realism as a theory, as a set of sentences, these sentences express the set of all worlds. Right? They're the one necessary truth that everyone always knew, right? That you could never have failed to know. And if you don't kind of believe modal realism, it's because you don't understand what this theory says, right? Because if you would understand that this theory expresses the set of all worlds, of course you would believe it. So somehow your ignorance must come from the fact that you don't get it, right? That's what you would expect from this kind of empiricist epistemology. But of course, that's not at all how Lewis presents the case for modal realism. It's not like, well, just look what I said. If you don't agree, you don't get it, right? Rather, he presents very elaborate arguments, and he seems to think it's a matter of weighing costs and benefits, and he thinks in the end it's inconclusive. And this across metaphysics, right? From many debates, he seems to assume the standards in metaphysics are similar to the standards in the sciences. We have different theories and virtues like simplicity and unificatory power, systematicity. One thing he cared a lot about is conservatism. Don't disagree too much with common sense and what we thought earlier. So there are all these virtues, and you wonder, how do they make sense if we're talking about like necessary truths, which are either the tautology or the contradiction, or the set of all worlds or the empty set? Why does it matter whether something's conservative or simple? He also thinks there's no knockdown arguments. In the end, he says in this memorable passage in his Introduction to Philosophical Papers 1 that when all is said and done, philosophy is a matter of opinion, right? Like we can't show that one side is wrong, the other side is right. That's odd if one side is defending the set of all worlds and the other the contradiction, the empty set. Like, isn't there clearly one side is like, why couldn't we show that? And even stranger, he professes ignorance of various metaphysical issues, right? He says, I don't know if they're duplicate worlds, qualitatively indistinguishable worlds. He says he doesn't know. Right? He says he doesn't know if positive and negative charge are somewhere co-instantiated. He doesn't know if there's a size of space, possible space-times and what it is. Lots of things. And he's neutral between like universal tropes and primitive resemblance. It seems like there are all these issues on which he's unsure and ignorant of. And you wonder, how is that supposed to work if there's no such thing as uncertainty about non-contingent matters? So that's the puzzle. I think it's fairly easy to see, right? There's an official epistemology, which is empiricist insofar as there's nothing interesting to learn within the non-contingent realm, and there is the puzzle of all this metaphysics going on, which is all about non-contingent things, or almost all. Yeah, that's the ones I'm interested in. Okay, so first and perhaps most obvious way to reconcile, as it were, the empiricist epistemology and the rationalist metaphysics. Well, I should set aside. So there are other things you could do. So Frank mentioned one nice thing that sometimes works if there seems to be ignorance of non-contingent facts, like water's H2O, is to do the kind of two-dimensionalist thing. This won't work in the metaphysics cases, so I won't even talk about it, basically because the A intension in jargon is also necessary here, so we don't get something contingent by doing the kinds of tricks, which I like, which work in other cases, but so that's not going to work here. What I want to look at a little more is extending this quotational idea. So the idea that what really is the subject matter isn't the non-contingent thing that seems to be the subject matter, but some contingent thing about words or concepts. So this is the idea that I suggested for the apparent ignorance of ophthalmologists being eye doctors. It's really ignorance of a surrogate proposition, a contingent proposition that ophthalmologist means eye doctors. So the idea would be, can we find something that metaphysical debates are about that's contingent? And that could be what we're really studying under the guise of these necessary truths. And the obvious suggestion is, yeah, we're looking at, again, our words or maybe our concepts. So we really want to know something about how we apply terms or something like this. And this looks more attractive for some parts of Lewis' metaphysics than others. It looks okay. I'll get you some problems. It looks okay for the many parts in Lewis's metaphysics where he's doing conceptual analysis, right? So he puts forward lots of analyses of lots of things, often in the context of this big reductive project of Humean supervenience, where he wants to show everything is a priori entailed by the mosaic, and to show that something's a priori entailed by this mosaic, the way he does it is to give an analysis of the various things we believe in, and then you can see, so if that's what pain is, you can see how the mosaic makes it true. So we get the analysis of pain, well, not really one, but a sketch of what an analysis of pain would look like. We get some for causation laws and conventions and all kinds of other things. And now, if you put forward an analysis, C causes E if and only if so-and-so, the thing you're putting forward looks non-contingent, right? If that is true, it's presumably meant to be necessarily true. Maybe it should even be prefixed with necessarily. And then it would plausibly be necessarily true. Anyway, it's supposed to be not a contingent claim. It's supposed to be some kind of a priori or necessary claim. But the current proposal is no, really, what we're talking about is whether the word cause applies to all and only those things, well, applies in all and only those cases where, and then comes the analysis. Or maybe it's a claim about my dispositions, maybe, or our disposition. I'm disposed to classify things as causing if and only if so-and-so. And that, as I said, I mean, if you're sympathetic at all to this surrogate proposition idea, then I think this shouldn't sound so bad. So let's think of how we respond to counterexamples. Let's say you liked the justified true belief analysis of knowledge, and then comes the Gettier example. Here's a story of what's going on. Oh, I thought I'd classify all cases of justified true belief as knowledge, and here's a case, and I find myself clearly judging this isn't knowledge, but it's also clearly justified true belief. So I learned something. What did I learn? Maybe I learned something about my dispositions, right? I thought I had the disposition to classify all and only the true justified belief cases as knowledge, and I found I don't. I just found myself being really reluctant to calling this knowledge in the Gettier case. So I discovered something contingent about myself, right, about my dispositions to apply terms or concepts, if you want. And so that's the idea that if we're talking about a necessary truth, it's kind of unclear why this contingent discovery about my dispositions is of any relevance. But if we're talking about a theory that's really about how we're disposed to classify things, as on the surrogate propositions idea we do, it's obvious why that's relevant. Right? So I think it's not too implausible that we could make sense of some of what Lewis does on this model as really being about our words or dispositions. And does this make sense of Lewis's, like the way Lewis approaches metaphysical questions? Superficially, I want to say yes. So let's think of the virtues again. Conservatism, why should that be a virtue? Well, it seems plausible if our goal in this case is to analyze our concepts, that you want to stick close to things we thought earlier, otherwise you're just changing the topic, right? If you want to do an analysis, like it seems like kind of obvious that you shouldn't say lots of things that seem obviously false, right? So that seems okay. Simplicity, systematicity, and so on. In general, why all these virtues that you find in the empirical sciences? Well, it's obvious why you find them here, because we're doing empirical science, right? On the current proposal, where the real subject of inquiry, the real object of inquiry, is contingent claim about our linguistic dispositions, we're basically doing armchair science, right? We're studying linguistic dispositions, which fortunately you can do without labs, if you're at least mostly interested in your own. So yeah, it makes sense that we have the same kinds of theoretical standards than empirical science, because it is empirical science. So that makes sense. Why are there these standoffs? No conclusive, like, winner. That also makes sense. It's the underdetermination of theory by observation, right? That's something we know happens in science all the time. You can always say, no, I still hold on to my theory, it's just the measurement went wrong. And you can say this in the get-here case. You could say, yeah, knowledge still is justified true belief. We're just always confused when we think about get-here cases, so we really are disposed to classify them the right way, but the disposition is always masked. You could say that, ridiculous, but you know, it's the same kind of thing where that you find in science. There's just no conclusive proof that the truth is one way than the other. It's part of the point, right, that the theories go beyond the evidence which Lewis accepted. So that seems all to fit really well. There's also one of the letters in the Letters of the Month page, I forgot to whom, where he says when he does analysis, he is, how does he put it? Put it down here. Putting forward fallible hypotheses into an independent mental realm that you cannot inspect directly. Right? That seems much in line with this idea that the analyses are really not hypotheses concerning necessary truth, but hypotheses concerning mental, like, dispositions. He's talking about, he explains in the letter that in his analysis he's interested in his dispositions to apply, classify things. So that seems to fit relatively well. Okay, so let me explain to you where we are. So there's this tension, right, between the empiricist epistemology and what looks like this whole a priori metaphysical inquiry. And on the current proposal, all the subject matter of the metaphysical inquiry isn't really non-contingent. It's actually contingent hypotheses about our dispositions. And I think this might be part of the answer, but at best part, because there are lots of things I think it doesn't really explain, or, yeah. So let me mention 3 problems. First, if you have a closer look at the virtues Lewis says a good analysis or a good metaphysical theory should have, there are some in there that are really puzzling if the subject matter is, let's figure out what our linguistic dispositions are. So as I said, you would expect something like simplicity and systematicity to play a role, but really you would expect to want systematicity and simplicity not in the analysis itself, but in the hypothesis about our dispositions. So you would expect things like, oh, here are general facts about our cognition. We use spatial reasoning even in non-spatial domains, and that's why we classify things here like that. That would be sort of a systematic explanation of the disposition. None even remotely like this ever, nothing like this ever happens in Lewis, right? This is, would be entirely alien to Lewis's analysis. Instead, we have simplicity, systematicity in the analysis. So when you spell out something causes something if and only if, blah, 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 the blah, blah, blah should be simple and systematic. It should, for example, be ontologically parsimonious. That, for example, in wholes, there's this discussion. Here's one analysis, here's another. This one has the advantage of being ontologically more parsimonious. This one has other advantages. So it seems like a good analysis should postulate fewer things, or fewer kinds of things. And that's entirely puzzling if what we're trying to figure out is our linguistic dispositions. Why should parsimony in the analysis, right? It's not that the theory posits fewer things, the theory of what our dispositions are. It's the analysis that postulates fewer things, which makes this more plausible as a theory of what our dispositions are. I don't know how that's supposed to work. So, point is, on closer inspection, the way Lewis evaluates even different analyses, it doesn't really make sense of this idea that he's really studying contingent claims about our linguistic dispositions. Second point, not all of Lewis's metaphysics is conceptual analysis, not by a stretch. There's the whole, like, I started with modal realism. That's not an analysis of something, right? There's this claim that there are these other worlds out there. There are various analyses floating around, but the basic hypothesis isn't, it's hard to see how it's a hypothesis about our linguistic dispositions. Which dispositions, right? It's the claim that we were always disposed to say that something's possible if it's the case at some maximally spatio-temporally related fusion of individuals. I don't know. I mean, this seems implausible that we had such a disposition. In any way, that doesn't seem to be the subject matter. It just seems Seems very implausible to me that that's what we're doing. So when Lewis puts forward things like modal realism, I think the project he's engaged in is kind of similar to the project of axiomatizing a theory. So you got a theory, lots of sentences, let's say, and often we're interested in finding a nice way to generate all of those, so a compact summary, as it were, of the whole theory. And when Lewis thinks about how Lewis gets to other worlds, he notices he finds himself quantifying over possible worlds as a philosopher, but also he thinks even the folk quantify over possible things and possible ways things could have gone. And so unless we want to reject all of that, we need to make sense of it. So it's part of, we start with this theory of things we want to believe, sentences we want to accept. And then we try to find an elegant way of generating all of these. So do we have to take this talk at face value, or can we paraphrase it away, the talk of there are other ways things could be? And Lewis wants to say, to some extent, we have to take it at face value. Long chapter why the fictionalist paraphrases don't work. And then, okay, so we have to quantify over these possibilities or possible worlds. What are there? Long chapter about there cannot be sets of sentences, other things we already believe in. So there have to be some things. Are they sui generis? Long chapter, no, that won't work either. And then the best thing, hey, there are these other, like concrete, spatiotemporally maximal things. So it's, I think of it as a way of, look, here we start with all these sentences. Can we somehow, some of them we can get rid of if we think of, well, is this really something we need to take as primitive, or can we analyze it in terms of something else? I think of it as like an axiomatization that you want to find for let's say, physical theory or a logical theory, where you try to like get rid of some primitives, see, oh yeah, we can define this in terms of the other, and then you got a nice basis from which the whole thing can be generated with as few primitives as possible. And if that's what we're doing, I think it's just entirely implausible that this is a way of figuring out our dispositions or anything about our mind. It's just a different kind of project. Finally, so third worry about this hypothesis that the true subject matter in metaphysics is always something contingent about words or concepts. There are other reasons why I think we need a further story in our empiricist intentional epistemology than this surrogate propositions idea that reduces all apparent ignorance of necessary truths to ignorance of contingent truths. Because think of maths. So when let's say, I want to know what are the prime factors of 1509. I can tell you if you give me a minute or so, and I'll go through the prime numbers, the small ones, and I'll see, can I divide? And lots of little steps, right? I know how to do it for 2, for 3, I know a trick. For 5, it's easy. For 7, it's a bit more complex. But there are lots of little steps. At each little step, it seems I'm making some progress towards the answer. What's happening on this empiricist model? Right? There's no special realm of maths to which I gain insight by thinking, right? So what's happening? On the surrogate proposition idea, where we would have to say, at each step I gain information about some contingent matter of fact, and I put these together and I learn some other contingent fact in the end, maybe about what prime factor means or something. I just find it completely implausible that this correctly characterizes my epistemic progress. It's a bit subtle because it's actually true that at each step I acquire contingent information about the world. So when I learn 1509 is divisible by 3, are we all right? So when I figure out that this is divisible by 3, I have also figured out that I'm disposed to say that it's divisible by 3. So by thinking, I've found something out about my dispositions, right? So it's actually true and kind of surprising that by mere thinking, I can find out contingent facts about the world, namely that I'm disposed to say certain things when I think about them, as I just did. So this happens, yes, okay, but it just seems entirely incidental to my mathematical progress, right? So, okay, I found out that I'm disposed to think this, but really, by way of figuring out the prime factors of 1509, whatever I learn along the way about my dispositions is just neither here nor there, right? I could do it all like without ever paying attention to the contingent things I find out along the way. So I'm just registering to you what might be obvious to you anyway, that this surrogate proposition account, which tries to defend the empiricist models, doesn't really work across the board. So I sadly agree, even though I would have liked this to work across the board. So we need something else. And so I'm going to suggest very roughly what this something else might look like, and suggest maybe that's what we're doing in metaphysics when we're not doing analysis. Okay, so again, if you've drifted out, here's where we are so far. So problem, empiricist, epistemology, rationalist, apparent rationalist, metaphysics, how do they fit together? One idea was, no, all the metaphysics is actually about contingent things. So we're just finding out contingent things, no problem, because the empiricist epistemology allows for that. And I said, I just don't believe it. Right? Some metaphysical inquiries might be about linguistic dispositions, but many are not. There's something else. And so how do the other things fit in the empiricist epistemology? So here's my vague stab at what's going on. What's really missing, I think, in the models you find in formal epistemology is not the substantive knowledge of non-contingent matters, because there's no such thing. Rather, it's a reflection of the obvious fact that as physical creatures, we have to store information in some format or other. Right? We don't store sets of possible worlds somewhere in our brain, right? So we have to encode them somehow, right? As pictures and sets of sentences, whatever you want, right? And some way or other, information needs to be stored. And if it is to be applied to a problem, it has to be retrieved, and it has to be maybe manipulated a little to the task at hand. And if you've ever programmed anything, or even thought of what it would be like to program anything, you'll notice that how you store information makes a big difference, right? You can store information in a way that makes it really easy to apply to a task, and you can store it in a way where you need a lot of manipulation before you can perform the relevant task. And that's something that's happening when you get some information and you have to manipulate the vehicles, not the content, not what's represented, but the vehicles. You have some strings or some numbers, and you need to manipulate them so that you get, in the end, the thing you want to do with it. And that's something that's entirely missing in the Bayesian models. Rightly so, I want to say, because that's a detail of implementation. It could go one way, could go the other way. It shouldn't be part of the model. But of course, it's happening, and it's happening in us to the extent that we are approximated by these models. So we store information in some way or other, I don't care how, and when we have to apply the information we have to a task, you ask me, what are the prime factors of 1509? I have the information stored, right? Maybe the necessary truth, I have that stored, it doesn't take much storage. Maybe it's the surrogate information about what the words mean. I have it, but it's in a form it needs to be manipulated. And that's what's going on, I think, when we do maths. We manipulate the symbols until we come up with the desired form of what we already had. The content was there all along, but there's something going on the level of vehicles, which looks like epistemic progress. And in some sense, of course, it is, but it's not acquiring new information. So if that's what's missing in the simple models, as I think it is, or the main thing that's missing, then the idea would be much of metaphysics can maybe also be understood as this kind of manipulating what we already have. So we have the information is there, but it's represented in a way where we'd kind of be interested in manipulating the vehicles so that we get the same information in another form. And this fits nicely this idea that what Lewis is doing in much of his metaphysics is a kind of like axiomatizing something. You take the theory and you try to, can I rephrase this in a way so that there are no longer any non-extensional terms? Lewis seemed to be quite interested in rephrasing everything he believed in so that there are no primitive non-extensional terms, right? No primitive tense, no primitive modality. And that, I think, is quite plausible, something that's happening on the level of vehicles. We have a linguistic representation of what we believe, like in sentences. And we want to say, okay, can we rephrase those in a way so that we can get rid of all the non-extensional bits? And on the way I'm seeing of it, this is really literally not acquiring any information. You know the same things in the end as in the beginning. It's just a matter of bringing the things you know in a form that you might want. And it's a bit unclear why we want the non-extensional format for all the things we believe, but maybe that's the game. Sorry, how long do I have? I didn't pay attention.
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes,
Yes.
okay, good. Yeah, that's all right. So, let me see what I can say in 5 minutes. Okay, so I have, of course, zero is textual support that Lewis believed any of the stuff I'm thinking. As I said, Lewis might have been more of a rationalist than me, right? Maybe he thought there are these, you can gain access to non-contingent metaphysical reality by thinking. But I think there's a version of Lewis, an empiricist, more empiricist version perhaps than the real Lewis, who could be sympathetic to this kind of spin on what he was doing. What difference does it make? So this will be the last 5 minutes. So what do we have to change, if anything, to what Lewis does in his metaphysics if we take him to have done what I think maybe the empiricist Lewis would have took himself to be doing? And I think it does make a difference, not only in the few scattered comments about metaphysics. And one example is, again, modal realism. So the way Lewis came to modal realism, I think it's easy to see, is through the world-time parallel. He started as a logician and philosopher of language. And if you do semantics, you'll see the pervasive analogies between tense and modality. And Lewis certainly saw these dimensions. That's one of the guiding lines in his philosophy. And Lewis inherited and accepted the four-dimensional picture of time, right? So past and present equally real, and future, and claims about the past are made true by, like, that there was a king called Charles is true because at some time in the past there is a king called Charles, right? We get rid of the intentional was and turn it into the tenseless is. No primitive truths that aren't like extensional, what there is and what properties it has. And Lewis just took all that and applied it to modality, right? Because he couldn't see how else we could license talking about worlds as he wanted to do. So other worlds just as real as this world, facts about what there could have been made true by what is the case at other worlds. And if that's how you come to modal realism, it's very natural to miss the crucial important disanalogy between time and modality, which is that what happens at other times is contingent. What happens at other worlds is not. Like if we're talking unrestrictedly. Of course, what happens at physically possible worlds is contingent. But what happens like across logical space isn't contingent. And so there's this big disanalogy, which Lewis didn't really pay so much attention to, like at least for much of his career, that got him to say various things, which my empiricist Lewis wouldn't have said, including all the things about his ignorance of what's happening throughout logical space, right? That he's not sure whether there are any worlds where something has positive and negative charge, or whether they're duplicate worlds. He treats it like ignorance of the past. There are just some things about the past we don't know, and entirely plausible, right? And just knowing everything about the present is not going to tell you everything about the past. By analogy, Lewis suggests that just knowing lots of things about the present is never going to tell you various things about other worlds. And that's one of his main objections to ersatzism, right? He says the ersatzists cook up all these ersatz worlds, but they have to tell us, like sets of sentences, they have to tell us which of them are possible, which of them represent possibilities. And they can't without appealing to primitive modality, because we just don't know what's possible or not. And for him, it's just out there, right? What's possible is what happens somewhere out there. And the ersatzists have to draw the line somehow else, and they can't without primitive modality. But I really think he shouldn't have said any of this, not just because it conflicts with this empiricist idea that really leaves no room for this kind of ignorance of what happens at other worlds, since it's non-contingent. But it also, I think it's actually incompatible with what he wants the worlds to do, right? He needs the world not just for making sense of intuitions about what could have been. He needs them as theory of content, theory of both mental and linguistic content. And they're having these like brute facts about what may or may not happen at other worlds gets in the way. Could talk about this for longer, but I won't. So this is one aspect, for example, this argument against ersatzism. I think he would lose that if he took my empiricist approach. Also, I think he would have to adopt more of a kind of metaphysical relativism, which you clearly see him to be not friendly towards. So say, this is the last bit I'm going to say, let's follow Lewis and thinking that it's a standoff between having universals and having primitive resemblance. You can do it with the universals, the tasks he thinks need to be done by universals. You can have universals, you can have a primitive resemblance relation. Both of these work. There's like no knockdown objection. It's on balance, costs and benefits, they're even roughly equal. What is happening here? Lewis seems to think, well, at most one of us is right. Either there are universals or there are not. Whereas on my redescription of what's going on is, well, we can re-axiomatize, as well, or axiomatize our whole system of beliefs in one way where we're postulating these universals, getting rid of other things, postulating universals. Another way, we have this primitive ideology of perfect resemblance in one respect. And these are two different, like I don't mean axiomatization literally, like, but the projects that look a bit like axiomatization. These are two different ways of doing it, of re-expressing what we believe on the level of linguistic representation. And if they're both equally okay by our standards, then why would one of them have to be right and the other wrong, or both wrong, right? Why couldn't they both be okay? So that's the kind of relativism I see nowhere in Lewis. He seems to be a staunch realist about everything, right? But if he took my line, he would have to be a bit, I suspect he would have to be a bit more of a relativist here, where there's just no objective fact of the matter about whether they're universals or not, because, well, you can speak in that way, but you can also speak in the other way, and that both works. And I want to say that that must be the right story, because it's, what's the alternative? The alternative is that there's this mind-independent part of reality to which, by having reasoned, we've figured out what's the case, and I just don't buy that. So these are some things I think Lewis would have to approach at least a bit differently. So it makes a difference here and there, but I think overall you can rescue a lot of Lewis's metaphysics even if you take the empiricism seriously, right? You don't have to go all Bas van Frazen or something. Okay, that's all.
Thank you.